So, to recap, okay, if someone is diabetic, right, we say a lot of times they have problems with their insulin, right? The insulin, we're talking about how it doesn't allow the glucose to go from the blood into the cell. And here's where the system breaks down. Without the insulin, these glucose carrier proteins are not working efficiently, right? If they're not working efficiently, notice my glucose can't get transported into the cell. So my glucose stays out here in the blood. Right? The reason why these proteins aren't working efficiently is because they become saturated too fast. Remember, what does saturation mean again? They're full or they're maxed out. So in other words, these become maxed out too quickly. They can't work any faster. So they can't get all of the glucose from the blood into the cell, which means you're going to leave the glucose out in the blood. There's going to be a buildup of glucose in the blood. That gives John the high glucose blood levels that we're witnessing. All right? Okay. Questions on that?
So is insulin needed for these glucose carrier proteins to operate? Is that what the problem is? Okay.
Yeah, so the problem is we always talk about insulin being an issue, right? So the insulin is what actually helps these enzymes, these carrier proteins work efficiently.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, not all diabetic patients have this particular mechanism, but this is one of the common ones. Yeah, Kiro?
So your body creates natural insulin, right?
Yes.
So is that a thyroid problem?
Yeah, great question. So your body should produce natural insulin, right? Do you guys remember what organ is in charge of producing your insulin?
Pancreas?
Yeah, it's actually a pancreas issue. Yeah. And so that's why a lot of times diabetic patients get insulin injections because their pancreas might not be producing enough insulin or the proper type of insulin that the body needs. Without the insulin, these proteins don't work efficiently. They can't transport the blood sugar into the cell, so therefore the sugar stays in the blood. Then when you do your little tests, you get a high blood sugar reading.
So the difference between type 1 diabetes and type 2 is polar opposite, so one transports too much glucose into the cell?
The problem between 1 and 2 is one, I forget which one's which. One is where you can't actually produce the insulin. The other one you can actually produce the insulin just fine, but the insulin doesn't work properly here. So one type of diabetes, actually insulin injections is the most efficient way to help solve it because it's the problem of using the insulin, not the inability to make it. Okay. All right. Okay. So that was a great example of carrier-mediated transport, but passive. Now let's look at an example of active. So active, remember, is when you have to go against the concentration gradient. And remember, active is going to need energy, usually in the form of ATP. So a great example of this is actually your muscles. Right? We all know, hey, muscles require a lot of energy. Right? That's why we talked about, for example, storing up sugar in our muscles as glycogen. Right? We want energy for our muscles. Here's one of the reasons why our muscles demand so much energy. To keep muscles working well, you have to keep levels of calcium high outside the cell. Calcium is actually another ion very important in muscles. We always think about it as bones, but it's important in muscles too. So for muscles to work properly, you always want a high amount of calcium outside the cell and a lower amount of calcium inside the cell. But the problem is every time you contract your muscle, calcium actually goes through the channel and it enters the cell. So after the contraction, you have to make sure you pump calcium back out. But notice, if you're pumping calcium back out, you're going from low to high against the concentration gradient. So that's where ATP comes in. So you actually need ATP to get the calcium out of the cell to keep that high concentration gradient out. Again, that's why one of the reasons why muscles are so demanding in energy. Another example of a cell that's very demanding in energy is neurons. Right? You all know the brain cells also demand a lot of energy for very similar reasons. In a neuron, you're going to use active transport, but in this case, it's sodium and potassium. I'll go into a little more detail, But in general, what the sodium-potassium pump needs to do is it needs to pump sodium and potassium against their concentration gradient in order to keep the neuron active, in order to keep the neuron working well. So in general, you use energy in the form of ATP here to make these concentration gradients, right? To go against the concentration gradient. And then eventually what's going to happen, and I'll show you guys next, is you're going to use the gradients of the cell to do work. It's basically going to be a coupled reaction. We're going to go, the energy from the ATP is used to make the concentration gradient, and then we're going to use the concentration gradient to do work in the cell. Right? Okay. So, our last 15 minutes, we're going to focus more on how this works. And we're going to do this by focusing, for example, mostly on a neuron. A neuron and a muscle cell, they'll actually create what we call membrane potential, and that's how they're going to be working. And again, this is going to require energy. ETC, the electron transport chain, works in a similar way. You guys might recall, remember electrons go down the chain, and then protons get pumped out against their concentration gradient, and then eventually the protons come through ATP synthase. Right? That's another example where our source of original energy isn't ATP, but it's actually the electrons going down. And then that's coupled to the proton concentration gradient, ultimately to the ATP pump. All right. Okay, so just to summarize this before we do our little activity, transport across the cell membrane is selectively permeable and can occur, bless you, with or without carrier protein. Transport can be active using energy or passive using diffusion. Oops. And now we can go into a good example of how this applies to the cell. Before we dive into the cell, I'm going to start off with something that you guys might understand a little better, which is just a simple battery. So discuss with your neighbor. Just take about 1 to 2 minutes. Look at these two examples of batteries. Just write down a few key